Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webcast, How to Build a Framework for Information Governance Success. We're very excited to have all of you on board. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. My name is Anne-Marie Cochia, Director of Marketing here at Canon Business Process Services, and I'll be your moderator for today's webcast. Before we get started, I do have a few quick housekeeping notes. To eliminate background noise, all participants have been muted. You will only be able to hear our presenter speak. If you'd like to ask us a question, you may do so at any time by clicking the Q&A button in the WebEx dashboard on the right of your screen. Type your question and click Send, and we'll try to address your question before the end of the session. Because we only have limited time today, we do apologize in advance if we are unable to address your question online, but we'll be sure to follow up on any unanswered questions after the program. Lastly, we will be sharing an archived version of today's webcast with all of you after the program is complete. And let's move on to the agenda. As part of our webcast series on information governance, today we're talking about establishing a framework. In particular, we will first discuss what are the components of information governance, the framework, the pitfalls, and then the business benefits. We have a great deal of information to share with you today, so let's get started. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Melissa Carlis. Melissa has over 16 years of experience helping companies develop an information management strategy and program that meets business objectives and minimizes risk. Melissa has written a number of articles and is a frequent speaker at industry events and is an Information Governance Solution Senior Director here at Canon. Melissa, we're so glad to have you on board today. Thank you for carving out this time to share your expertise.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you everyone that's in attendance. Very quickly, for those who are not aware of who we are Canon Business Process Services, a subsidiary of Canon, and through our outsourcing services to Fortune 500 companies and AM Law 250, you'll see a listing of our services here, which are a wide range of services that we provide to improve business performance and to be more efficient. We encourage you to visit our website, which is cbps.canon.com. This is a slide that we've used in many previous presentations that you have access through YouTube to review. And what we want to communicate through this is that information governance is not an independent initiative. In Canon, we view it as being part of this circle. It is part of records, it's part of imaging, and you'll notice that we have business process in front of our imaging because we're very adamant about not just scanning and putting a document or an image into a repository, creating more of a mess. What we do is we map it out, we put a taxonomy on it, we put it into a particular repository, and then we manage it similar to what we do with our physical records. We are tied very intimately with e-discovery and lit support. E-discovery and lit support needs information quickly and accurately. You really want to control the expenses of having external vendors coming in and trying to find information that you should have at hand. That is the requirement for information governance, to have that direct communication with those two areas. Business process outsourcing is a very important and growing division at Canon, and we work intimately with them in working with automation and how to get into the workflow of various systems and improving it. But obviously, you've got to have security, confidentiality, records management, all built within it. And then our business process assessment. Once again, this is a reference to another webinar that we presented on how do you get started in anything that deals with information governance. And we will be referring to that later, but in reality, you can call it something similar to a gap analysis. We have here a parking lot, and we're referencing this as we acknowledge that there are critical elements of information governance that must always happen, but that's not the focus of our presentation today, but I didn't want to ignore them because they are very important. So obviously you need the leadership In our industry, the trend is going towards Chief Information Governance Officer, but having dedicated personnel to information governance. You obviously need executive sponsorship. If you don't have it, it's not going to happen. You also have to be mature and have a very good understanding of the security and legal obligations when you're dealing with data. I put in 2 bullets here underneath that for quick reads that are very helpful, even if you're in say a law firm and you say, well, maybe I don't need to know about the SEC. You actually do because your clients are concerned with it. With publicly traded companies, you have to be aware of it, but it's a good read just for good practices and what's happening in the industry. Also, National Conference of State Legislatures, you can go in there, look up the states where you have physical locations, and you'll find a lot of valuable information there. Cross-pollination has to happen. This information governance is not going to happen with at least these components. So once again, these are any attendance to conferences, webinars, you'll hear this mentioned, so we're acknowledging, yes, it's important. And project management, these are, this is a very difficult and time-consuming task if you are about to launch any program. So make sure that you have a project manager as part of this, or you have a PMP level skill set yourself. You're going to need it throughout this process. So this is a model that is recognized and acknowledged in our industry. It's extremely helpful in keeping yourself focused. You'll notice that in the middle is the basis of records management, where as you create data, as you ingest it, these are the duties around it, what's considered an asset, and what you ultimately do, whether you dispose it or whether you archive it. Where information governance plays a part in is the outer rim of the circle. So the profit that you can get from information governance, the risk that you have to identify when it comes to anything with legalities, with records and information management, and the privacy and the security. And then the efficiency that you will get when IT is involved, when you roll this out, you're going to make everyone's ability to access their information in a completely different manner than you currently have. So keep this model in mind, keep it in your focus. Okay, this is my favorite slide of the presentation. We do hope that you find this to be a very informative webinar, but before we launch into the serious information and the topic, I wanted to explain that there are many areas that people frequently question me. They're looking for an easy answer. What is the ROI to IG? How much will this cost? Can you give me the top 5 best practices that are relevant to my company, to my organization, to my vertical? And these are really gray areas. And you don't know those answers until you go through the steps, the 10 steps that we're going to go through today. But I can tell you with confidence that there's one question I can answer clearly. Let me start out by telling you a story. There's a long-term care company that planned to hire a chicken farm to shred its healthcare documents. And this was only investigated, it was only found after someone at that organization reported that healthcare documents were being dumped into bins. The healthcare facility thought that if they went to a chicken farm, that this was a secure way to, dispose of their sensitive documents. As the chickens roosted, as they did their business, now the documents are unreadable. So I can say with all clarity that this is not information governance and it is a foul practice. But don't bump. All right, so let's get down to business. When we talk to our clients and when we're building our information governance framework, these are the 10 areas in which we focus. Obviously, every vertical is different, every client is different in their maturity level, so we deal with that accordingly. However, these are the areas that you as someone that's going to be building this must focus. So the first step is, here's a sample of Canon's information governance framework. You'll see that there are 5 phases, and we've talked about these in other presentations, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but you will be sent this presentation. You can look at this in detail. We always start out with our business process assessment, which once again, that's a gap analysis. The report is our Bible that we use throughout the rest of the phases, where we find out what we have, where it is, what's going on, and where we lack in security, privacy, etc. We come up with recommendations that we present to our sponsors and to our decision makers, and then we spend a lot of time on phase 3 planning for change. And once again, you can see the steps that we take when you get this document sent to you. Implementation is where you need that project management that I mentioned earlier, and then your analytics. Analytics is incredibly important in information governance because it's how you show that you're being compliant. That's another buzzword that we use, compliance. Compliance to what? Well, you're compliant to what you built in phase 2 and 3. And so you use your analytics that you show progress, that you're auditing, and that you're moving on to other things that make your information governance mature throughout its rollout. However, an approach that you can use that's very simplified is, here are phases 1 through 5 that basically mirror what I just said, but you can use it and make it relevant to your company, to your vertical, to your clients, to the regulations that are important to you as you do your business. You do your assessment, 90 days, that's what the cutoff time should be for you. You get people involved, you get them excited, you get the sponsorship, you might even get a little bit of a budget, and you move forward. If you go past 90 days, you're starting to lose the traction. So that's the cutoff date that we give to our own clients, and that one I recommend to you. And you can see all the steps listed under there. Research and recommendations, that's what I was mentioning in our business process assessment that we use. However, you can use it in your report, and once again, listing of what you should do. That should happen in month 3. That should take you a month. That's very dedicated. Now, for those that are in national companies or even global companies, you have to be reality-based on this and say, look, we're only going to take a chunk of this part of our company. For instance, we're a subsidiary of Canon USA, so maybe we focus only on Canon Business Process Services right now. You have to make the decision, and you have to make this doable, but I am very much recommending that you don't spend more than a month because you really want to keep people engaged. You don't want to interview people and then 8 months later come back and say, remember? They're not going to remember. They're not going to be interested. Same thing with proof of concept. What you decide coming out of your research and your recommendations, what your executive sponsor has approved and budgeted and given you time to do, you want to pick out an area in which you launch your proof of concept. And once again, here are some items that you can do, but I always limit that to year 1. Now, if you can get it done in less than a year, I highly recommend that, but you also have to be realistic about it and put that in your timeline so that you're setting the expectations. Your next phase, obviously, is your enterprise rollout and what that entails. 5 is the future steps, because you always want to be working on the maturity of your information governance program.
Thank you, Melissa. That takes us to our poll question. We very much like to hear from our audience here. What phase of the information governance transformation is your business in? Would you say that it's the assessment phase, research and recommendations, proof of concept, enterprise rollout, future steps, or would it be another phase? So please take a moment. We'd very much like to hear what you have to say here, and we'll take a few seconds for folks to log in their response. Okay, we'll just take a few seconds more. So Melissa, what I'm seeing here is 20% are in the assessment phase. Research and recommendations is about 10%, proof of concept 5%, enterprise rollout 15%. And we have some in the other. So are you surprised by this response?
No, and actually the assessment has increased to 24%. Information governance is in its infancy stages right now. It was introduced a few years ago. It's gaining traction over the past 2 years, and there are many vendors, many consulting groups that are now introducing it to companies, and companies are actually training up their employees in it. So I'm not surprised by this, and I'm also actually encouraged that they are in phase 1 because that's a difficult stage and it's difficult to get traction. So I hope that by the time we're done with this webinar, I've given you a couple of hints to get you started and past that initial stage. All right, so we're going, as we mentioned earlier, there are 10 steps, not in particular order, but what we think are the most important items to include in your information governance program. And you'll notice that some of these are slanted back to the records management and information management mindset, but remember, information governance grew out of records management. So let's always go back to our roots and know that there's a solid foundation to help you jettison this to the next phase and to the next steps. Make sure that you have an updated retention schedule and a records policy. And I want to start by focusing on the policy. It is not the procedures. A policy should be one page stating what your stance is, what your company's stance is on records and information management, information governance, whatever you deem your language or your verbiage. You think of HR and how they have policies. They have a sexual harassment policy in which you must sign when you join the company. You must behave in a certain manner. Think of it like that. It's something that employees are introduced to it immediately as they join your company. It's something that your employees, your current employees, have to sign and acknowledge in notifying that they are expected to participate in it and behave accordingly. It also should have, in both the policy and the schedule, very enforceable language. You should not have words like could or should, because this is the basis for defending your actions. If you leave it open to interpretation, so can the courts, so can your clients, so can your vendors. Come in with very strong language as to what people are to do. And it also eliminates confusion. As you're rolling this out, this is all about change management. And so if you're coming in with language that says do X, Y, and Z at this particular time, et cetera, you're having employees that can buy in because they understand their role. And the goal of having a policy is protection of that personal, your employees' information, the client information, and your overall organization's intellectual property. You can see how important this policy is. The schedule, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because we just want you to look at this schedule, which is truncated. Actually, our schedule is much more complex than this, but we wanted to give you an idea of what should be in a retention schedule. It should have numerous columns, putting in the document type, putting in descriptions. An example we always use is, what if I call it accounts payable, but you call it an invoice and a bill? You got to create buckets. And when you create those buckets called file types, you need to include anything and everything that's part of that bucket. You need to cite your research code. If you don't know the research code, then you know you have a problem because you know that legal in-house counsel has not reviewed this and doesn't even know why you came up with the number that you did to retain it. You'll see that there is the legal retention code, the user has his or her needs, you're recognizing them, and then you're creating your total retention based on those two items. You're also putting in convenience copies and what you do with them and whether vital. Vital is important to your IT group. A lot of times IT says, I don't understand, why do I have to talk to the information governance people or the records people? When something is dedicated or indicated as vital, IT knows that they need to back it up in a particular manner. Maybe they need to archive it in a special off-site cloud situation. They know that they need to preserve that for some reason to get up and running if a disaster occurs, etc. The bottom blocks are just tabs that we have. When we create these schedules, we have numerous tabs in which we collect data. So the output from the interviews, the legal research that we did, the version control, because numerous people are going to look at this, etc. But take a look at what your current retention schedule is, and here's one that's mature, and see where you land with that. All right, risk management. I cringe a little bit when I read this and hear this consistently. Information governance is all about risk management. but you have to understand what the risk is. It's a buzzword right now. You need to define it by vertical, by department, and even potentially the vendors and clients that interact with you. And I'll give you an example why what I mean by that. If you're talking to an accounting person, they're worried about SOX, or I should say a finance person. They're worried about accuracy, all right? Now you have HR. They're worried about protection of employee data. Then you go to sales, who we all know, a little bit loose with the company's intellectual property. You've got 3 different areas of potential risk there. So you need to learn to talk each and every department's language. You need to define the risk, and then that's how you go about managing it. So you start out with the gap analysis that I mentioned. You're interviewing every department by doc type, where they house it, and the risk associated with each one of those. The ROI will come. Even though I said cavalierly early that I don't have the ROI, I can eventually get you an ROI, as you can yourself, because you're going to do a study on what's risky for you, what's the cost of managing that risk and eliminating it potentially, and then how your company benefits from that, and there's your ROI. But be realistic that it's been cited in numerous studies that the #1 barrier to selling information governance within your company or your organization is that ROI. That's the #1 thing that people want to see, especially on the C-level. And you've got to be able to present something else in its stead and convince them that the ROI will be coming at a certain phase. So I just put here, I'm not going to go through these regulations, but these are ones that are out there. They affect a lot of what you do, or you may say, well, I'm a law firm, so I don't have to worry about SOX. Well, actually you do, because of the finance example I just gave you. But you also have to know that your vendors and your clients that you service, regardless of what your organization does, may have some of these concerns. And so even though you don't have it, if you're hosting some of their data or they're hosting some of your data, you've got to address it. So you'll be getting this, this presentation. These are very good reads, and they will help you when you're building your framework. And I'm happy to share others when we get to that point. All right, so this is a sample risk matrix. You know, it's a little colorful, but what we're trying to show here is that when you have identified your risk, don't simply put it in a Word document and show it to IT, show it to your C-level, show it to your executive partners. They're not going to read it. Instead, what you need to do, and continually update this, is put it in a high, medium, and low risk, and then identify it by time. You're going to constantly update this as you go through what we consider the 5 phases of building an information governance program to show that you're making progress, that you're lowering risk throughout it. So something that's high will hopefully go to your medium after certain phases. But you're going to constantly be showing this risk matrix, and you don't have to use this when it's just here for example purposes. Go out, get yourself one that's much more sophisticated or even more simplified, however your organization talks. But this is something that you will be showing to your cross-pollination team and to your executive sponsorship that shows that traction is being made and over time. All right, guideline resources. My recommendation is that you check out ARMA's maturity model and their generally accepted record-keeping principles. You may say, well, I'm not in records. That's okay. We've given you the direct links here that'll bypass your going to ARMA's site and trying to find them yourself. But these are very well-written, succinct guidelines to help you when you're building your framework and to keep you focused throughout this process. So the principles are based on 8 areas such as accountability and transparency, but it gives you a definition of what that means. And you can put that and you can assign those 8 principles to each of the risks that you've defined as you go through the other areas such as technology, moving data, security, and controls. You can apply these 8 principles each time. They should become your mantra. The other one that I like is the maturity model. That, if you will read these descriptions, and this will help you present to your sponsorship and to the cross-pollination committee that explains where you are in the information governance model. It's very well written. It shows you, and it even gives you samples of how you can build out your framework and how you know that you're maturing, so that if you're ranked 1 now, that you can say, well, I'm still a 1 in this area, but showing on my risk matrix, I've made movement into area 2. It's very helpful, and I highly encourage you that before you do anything, you read these 3 documents, or excuse me, these 2 documents. All right, technology. We're going down the list now. Pick it and stick with it. All right, so what does that mean? A lot of times I'm getting approached and saying, what enterprise content management system or ECM system should I have? Should I go out and get the latest and greatest? How much will it cost me? Is it $1 million, $2 million? We don't have it. My adage is information governance can be accomplished with the most basic of technology, and it can fail with the most sophisticated. So I'm going to repeat that since I stumbled a little bit. Information governance can be accomplished with the most basic of technology and fail with the most sophisticated. Because if you're only focusing on technology, you've missed the whole point of what information governance is. It's about security, privacy, confidentiality, and your behavior as an organization. So what I say instead is take 2 inventories. As part of your framework, you're doing an assessment, and as part of that assessment is the inventory of where your data is and your inventory of the technology that you have. And so as you go through and you're building that inventory of, and we're going to talk a little bit about data mapping in a minute, understanding what data you have, but also what repositories you have. So the example I used last time we had a webinar was we actually have a client that has 200 repositories. We have now, since that time that I mentioned it, whittled it to 50. That doesn't mean we're stopped at 50, but we've decided that right now the company needs 50 to function. And so we will go through that, but you will identify each repository that's available, its functionality, and how it can or cannot work within the information governance program. We'll talk about data mapping and repositories. What your goal is with the repositories in information governance is cull them, try to narrow them if possible. And I'm not saying randomly get rid of repositories. If you have 50 and you need 50, that's the reality of it. But do that assessment so that you can speak confidently that you know that you need them. You want to cleanse those repositories. You want to migrate data into the right repository for whatever that reason is. You're working with your compliance, risk, your IT, to whatever repositories that you make available to your employees, that there's security, ethical walls, and access controls built around all of them. Yes, shared drives, everything. You want to monitor usage. So as we talked about phase 5, what's next step? We mentioned a lot about auditing compliance. Well, auditing compliance is not only auditing your employees, but also the departments. If we've made the rule that personal drives are only to be used but for X, you can actually buy security technology like data leakage or crawlers that go in and do an analysis on what data is contained in a particular repository to help you not only blow the whistle on the employees, but saying to IT, you've broken the trust that we had that said we would only use these repositories for this usage. BYODs, biggest complaint we get, BYODs in emails. All of this is applicable to BYODs and emails. We don't have enough time for that to go over it, but you can build ethical walls. You can control usage and access to business information within the individual devices that your employees are bringing, or you can just simply ban all of them and say, we're going to issue whatever you use as your smartphone usage, and that way you can't mix the two. A lot of areas in which you can go there. And retention schedule application, whatever technology you have, inventory it that it can have the ability to apply a retention schedule. So it might be a field, it may be IT having to go in and administer it, it may be something that you administer it, but make sure that it can be done. If it can't, then that's not the right repository for you. You've got to find something else within your company. So we talked about data source mapping. This is a very oversimplified representation of what you would do through your asset and your inventory part of the assessment phase. But you can see here is we don't have any repository mentioned by any vendor, Canon included. So we know that you have shared drives. We know you have local drives. Many of you have SharePoint. Obviously, you have Outlook or Lotus Notes. Many of our Fortune 500 companies have microfilm, microfiche, aperture cards, physical records. We all have that. And then core. So for our oil, gas, our manufacturing companies, they have a lot of core samples. You can't just think of them as, you know, off to the side. You have to include them. There's many more items that could be listed here, but we just wanted to show you a sampling of what you will be touching when you go through your inventory process and your assessment. And I just want to clarify something. It is not Canon's viewpoint. It is my personal viewpoint that SharePoint cannot be your repository of choice. It is a collaboration tool, and I don't want everybody hanging up the phone right now on me, but we've noticed that with collaboration tools, there's a lot of chaos in there, and no one bothers to use the declaration of record, and that when you build a behavior, a program that says that to declare something of record, you have to physically remove it and migrate it into the another repository. People are easier to adapt that to then remember to do it in SharePoint to declare it as a record. And so then no one knows unless it's by version and they're guessing, okay, was this the last one? I don't know. Someone might have worked it on it and saved it in their shared drive or personal drive. All right. So data cleanup. We talked about that under technology, and this is an important area of information governance. I'm not saying that this is where we apply the retention schedule. I'm not saying that this is where we decommission the repositories. It's part of the culling that I mentioned earlier. You have, with confidence I am stating, what we call ROT, and it's an industry term actually, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. So an example of that is you have your salesperson or your attorneys or someone in your company creating a contract. They save that somewhere. They send it to legal, who reviews it and sends it back. Then purchasing agrees on it, then it's sent to whomever outside of the company. Then it's sent back and all these people get it. The salesperson or the attorney or whomever, procurement, then thinks that they have the official contract, but legal thinks that they have the official contract. That's called redundant, all right? Then we also have a lot of obsolete stuff that even if you look at your retention schedule, we're working with a client this week that the longest retention date that they had was 25 years. We found something from 1906. So with confidence, we were able to analyze and go back and say, in this bucket, we have 100-year-old data that has no relevance to intellectual property, to the vital record, et cetera, and we're able to purge that. So you want to do preparation analysis, so your inventory at this point is updated on both your technology and your data. You've interviewed everybody you can possibly interview. You now start to run analysis on redundant and obsolete and trivial information, and I'm warning you here that this is something that is not easy to do. It's something that you want a subject matter expert internally or externally to be running for you. You want to identify anything that has missing retention codes, which could be all of your data, and then possibly you want to purge your redundant, obsolete, and trivial information. I'm not going to go through the rest of this. I just want you to understand that your cleanup process is over the solution deployment lifecycle of updating your technology. And you'll have this, once again, at your fingertips that you can read this at your leisure. The next slide is for those that understand workflow better. So if you're talking to someone in IT or a C-level that likes to understand, well, what happens once you analyze the data? What is the next step? What if we run into issues or concerns, yes, no, boxes that help us? This is just another sample that you can use to understand how you get your data ready for purging.
Excuse me, Melissa, I do see that we have a write-in question here, and the write-in question is, Canon did not recommend technology here. Why is that?
Well, it goes back to what I said earlier. First of all, we are not talking about the right technology to use because there is no right technology. It's understanding what you have available now and making it ready for an information governance program. Now, that could be simply using what you have. It could be getting an upgrade, talking to your vendors and saying, you know, we purchased this from you 2 years ago, but the industry has changed, or we do have a budget, let's go out and source on that. Because there are ECM products, IBM, HP, OpenText, they're all great products. Canon has therefore, but it has to be applicable to how you do business and how far you need in workflows and data management. Oh, and just thank you for the questions. That was a great question, and thank you for stopping me to clarify that. All right, so now we're ready to move our data. You're going to notice that we will be repeating three terms over and over again: analyze, cleanse and validate, and migrate. So we're not going to spend too much time on the data culling because I believe that if you look back at the previous slides, you have an understanding of what I'm doing. But we wanted you to get a full training on when we say analyzing, what does that mean? What data sources should you have? That you should be putting it into buckets, that you should be developing data models even before you say that this is the right technology. Have some concept of what you want your model to look like. Work with IT and say, what securities? I've read these regulations and citations. I've interviewed these people. This is all the data I've collected. We're in serious trouble when it comes to PHI or PII or SOX. What do we need to do about it? You're analyzing this as before and as you're moving your data. Pain points of legacy systems, do some testing. As we've tried to migrate out of certain systems, they're so old or the client has decided not to go through the various upgrades, we can't even get that information out of there. And we have to make a decision. Do we leave it there? Do we purge it? That's all part of analyzing in your inventory. Next one, cleansing and validating. Once again, it goes back to your retention schedule. You're establishing data types. You're coming up with a naming conventions that you will use in every repository, regardless of what you use, regardless of how many you have. You're going to validate your records definitions. Is this a record? Is it structured? Is it unstructured? Is it metadata? As many of you know, metadata is a big part of when you go through discovery processes. You've got to keep that metadata, and you've got to keep it whole so that you can prove your company's behavior and you can prove that you haven't your employees haven't had the ability to remove something, or they haven't checked it in and checked it out, and in the meantime, as they check it out, that they've changed it in any manner, etc. And just avoid data entry fatigue. You know, we have subject matter experts here at Canon that do this type of work, and you've got to mix it up a little bit, or you're going to start giving them such rote tasks that they're going to make errors. So that's just a warning there. Okay, and our migration. So this is, you obviously are testing everything you do before you migrate it. And IT is extremely helpful in this, but you also have to involve an end user group or division or people that are tech savvy to make sure that as you're moving the data, it's in repositories that work, that you have the definitions that they understand, that the buckets that you've used to call documents certain things, that they understand it. And you also want to take a breath, go back to your cross-pollination team, and have a tollgate meeting. This is all that I've accomplished thus far. This is the risks. This is how I'm addressing it. Before I migrate this data, before I even pilot it, are we all on the same page? You get the sign-off. Then after you do a pilot migration, you demo that, you take a breath, you get the tollgate meeting back together, and everybody's on board, they're signing it, or they're giving you their concerns and their issues, and you're stopping. If you remember in the generic phases 1 through 5 that I showed you, it said 90 days for the assessment, the 3rd month coming back with the recommendations, and then almost a year to get your information governance program started and on its way. This is why. You're moving this data, cleansing it, culling it, piloting it. This is a lot of work. As you're doing this, obviously you want to be concerned about security and controls. How are you ingesting and creating information? How are you managing it? How are you ultimately archiving it? How are you addressing the smartphones? And how are you dispositioning it? So if a vital record has to be around, or even if it's not a vital record, maybe it's just vital information and it's not considered a record but IT wants it, then you have to archive it so that it's read-only, that only certain people have access to it, that possibly it's in the cloud as a backup, it's at a hot site, etc. You really want to keep this in mind, that security and controls have to be in place every time you're touching data, every time you're moving it, and every time you're culling it. Areas of concern, this is where it gets messy, because everything on here is based on employee behavior. It's easy to do management of repositories that are behind the firewall, in the network, but when you allow cameras and smartphones and people, you have a garbage can, instant messaging, this is all people related. And so you have to keep these items in focus as you go throughout this process. This is a slide that our Canon's information security officer uses, and I really like it. We talk about firewalls, anti-malware, everything sophisticated out on the market. Canon's in the mix and applying it to its own information. Organizations are using more sophisticated tools and data protection schemes to block external attacks. So attackers look for the weakest link, people. I love this quote, and it's very applicable to the items that were listed on the above slide. The documentation, from those in the records industry, we're used to this. But for those that are not and you're launching or you're in charge of your information governance program, all I can say is document every single thing that you do. Find a database, a repository, a place where it's backed up as standard behavior within your company that you can show proof of behavior. Because as you kick this off, you are identifying risk, you are working with metadata, you're impacting discovery and audits by your movements and by the phases of what you're doing. So you need proof of behavior. You need that sign-off when I mentioned the toll gate meetings. Be careful. Make sure you're documenting everything. Update your retention schedule to reflect the new buckets. You may not be ready right now to do the research on updating the citations and the regulations, but you're updating it so that it's more sophisticated, that it's addressing unstructured, structured, rot, permanent, vital, copies, etc. You're also looking at the policy that you had issued. We talked about that as the #1 step. You're creating a procedures manual on everything that you do. You may not want to finish it at this point because you're not done, but you're creating templates and you're keeping that updated as you go along. And your asset listing. Remember, we started out with 2 inventories. You want to update that consistently. If you are culling the number of repositories that you have, you want to make note of when you did that, why, when it happened, having IT sign off on it. If you've cleansed, if you've purged, if you've moved or transitioned data, that's considered an asset. You want to make note of that. So this should, and other things, be included in your documentation.
Melissa, I do see we have another write-in question, and the question is, for such a complex project, how can we show the business we're making progress? What gets measured along the way?
Another great question. Thank you very much for asking. There are numerous things that you can track. Storage will decrease, security will increase, and you can show that. You can do testing. You can have IT have either their own internal testing or hire external vendors to come in and do those penetration testing. There's data leakage testing you can do, a variety that you're showing, hey, our security increased with and controls increased with every test that we performed. Also, the number of repositories is being whittled. Your index fields should show a level of completion that they never had in the past. Your policy is updated. That's showing traction. Your retention schedule is being applied or tracked and updated. But the number one way I would say that you can track for progress, if I had to be to list the number one, is most importantly is your risks. So you started this out by identifying what risks are applicable to you, to the divisions, to your organization, to the vendor's data that you may be hosting, to your client's data that you may be hosting, and you want to show progress in how you've addressed that risk. So you may not be making as progress as fast as you like, but as long as you're showing the steps that you're taking and that you are showing risk decrease. And I'll give you an example of PII. What enforcement do you have in place now? Is everyone trained on it? Has the cybersecurity vendor done the testing? These are all things that you can start showing as progress. All right, so we're coming to conclusion of our 10 steps, and we've lumped 8, 9, and 10 together. At this point, we need you to stop doing what you're doing and provide formal training. The employees need to know what's happening, because number 9 is where the most change is going to be happening. So you need to show them the formal training of what you've accomplished, why, your formal definitions, share a procedures manual, have an intranet site where they can access it, and really get the employee buy-in. Some of them already have been involved because of the piloting. They've all been involved because of the interview process. They need to know what's been done since. So this is your time to have road shows, webinars, whatever you can do to get the word out. And then you have attestation. You need them to acknowledge that they understand what's happening, that their behavior must change, and that there's more to come. Number 9 is the most dramatic. Now we're in the phase where we are applying the retention schedule on the repositories that were changed, or excuse me, that were selected. You're deleting information. You're permanently archiving information, which means now the end users may not have that free access that they once had. And you're decommissioning repositories. This is very, very dramatic for a company to go through that, so that lends to your formal training. Then once you're finished or as you're progressing through number 9, you start to roll out number 10. 10 is all about change management training. So you've just disrupted their world. You've taken away things that they've always had access to or information that they thought that they should own, and now, for instance, legal only owns it, et cetera, whatever you're building. We like to use this managing complex change. If you have a vision, you have the skill set through your personnel, you have that formal training, and you've shown that the incentives are everything that they're getting out of it, that they know the version control, that their information is protected, that they're not going to be on the news for security hacking, that they're not going to, have major audits and the FCC's visiting them and having that fear factor, that they have resources to go through because you have that cross-pollination team. You have an action plan. That's all about change. That's change management and how you control that. You'll notice that the boxes below this will have areas that are grayed out, and it'll result in confusion, anxiety, resistance, frustration, false starts, etc. So this is a really good change management framework that you can use to make you focus on what you're rolling out. Okay, pitfalls. Avoid the buzzwords. As I said, risk management, compliance, you're going to get the glazed eyes. Know the risk per department. We've gone through that. Research your regulations. I do caution you about the repositories. Once again, my personal opinion only. Be wary of collaboration tools. Be wary of personnel that have personal clouds and they're storing your organization's data in it. Allowing exceptions, we don't allow exceptions. So if you have a rainmaker, if you have a C-level person that says, well, that's good for the company but not me, then you're setting yourself up for failure. Instant messaging, emails, that's always the big item, hot item. There's an example court case that if you Google on this, you can learn that imaging through Symphony, which is what a lot of the banking institutions use for instant messaging, they deemed through the New York State Department of Financial Services that this instant messaging actually had relevance and that they had to keep every single instant message for 7 years, including the decryption keys had to be shipped out to external vendors. Proof of behavior. Continued data hygiene. This is not one and done. Once you've built this information governance program that can last anywhere from 1 to 3 to 5 years or however big your organization is, you need to keep being repetitive and making sure that data hygiene exists, that you're not having rot. And then I just gave another case here that you can look up, but there was no litigation hold. Withheld and destroyed electronic data. There was no electronic stored information supervisor, no monitoring of the legal hold compliance. I encourage you to read that case to find out what the result was. And paperless, that's a buzzword. I keep hearing that over and over again. Scanning is not the answer. Be very careful when you approach scanning. It may not even be necessary to give you an information governance program. And then key information governance benefits. I'm not going to go through this list. You can read this at your leisure. One of the things that could be built into your ROI, however, is the first bullet, and that is insurance rates. As you may or may not know, we now are, most organizations have insurance coverage for data breaches, and as you go through this information governance building, you can work with your insurance company to update them every step of the way so that they should be offering you discounts on your rates because of your behavior, and you can prove that through the documentation, through the inventorying, et cetera, everything that we've gone through in this presentation. Next steps, we have this as the wrap-up slide on all of our presentations. This, once again, is not one and done. You need to go back to your original goals and objectives, ensure that you are constantly meeting them. You may even want to update them. Your assessment observations, you not only need to do that initially, but you need to go out and observe, watch what's happening, monitor, audit, et cetera. Your information management and your workflow processes, this is, once again, where the exciting part starts, because as you get to phase 5, those are the future steps. Those are the next steps. And this information workflow processes, and the next step is where you get to be creative. Maybe it's where you get the new ECM because you've proven that your existing technology can only go so far. Or maybe you're building up your staff because this is getting momentum and you need help controlling the amount of data and keeping on top of the data hygiene, et cetera. So once again, you can look at this at your leisure and understand that you need to do this assessment annually, not only to keep yourself in check, but your company in check.
Well, thank you, Melissa. That concludes today's session, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. We hope you found today's insights helpful. Canon has a great deal of experience leading these data management initiatives. If you have any questions for Melissa or would like to learn more about how Canon Business Process Services is helping other companies develop and implement an information governance program, please contact us directly at the email address on your screen. I also would like to mention that as you leave us today, we have a short survey for you to answer. It's just a 3-question survey. We'd very much like your feedback on today's program. And that wraps it up, and thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon.